A president stood in his own palace and admitted he had no idea what he was doing, not because he was unprepared, because no one had handed him a reason to prepare for this. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a 21-year-old girl walking into a ceremonial hall in Manila broke a protocol that never even existed in the first place. Here's the setup. Her name is Eala. She's Filipino, she plays tennis, and until a few weeks ago, that sentence alone wouldn't have meant much to most of the world. The Philippines has produced boxing legends. It's produced weightlifting champions who brought home Olympic gold. It has a basketball culture so deep it borders on religion. But tennis? Singles tennis at the highest level? That box had always stayed empty. Nobody had filled it. So when Eala started climbing, really climbing, the country didn't have a template ready. It had never needed one. And that gap between what already existed and what she was about to force into existence is where this whole story lives. Because here's the tension nobody's talking about directly. How do you honor someone for doing something your nation has never had the chance to honor before? What do you even say? What's the citation supposed to look like when there's no precedent to copy from? Let's drop into the room for a second, because this is the moment that made headlines. Picture it, state cameras rolling, a framed citation being placed into her hands, and a grown woman, ranked 28th in the entire world, suddenly unable to find her footing emotionally. She'd said just minutes earlier that she doesn't usually get nervous speaking in public. Then, in front of the president of her country, her voice cracked anyway. She said essentially that tonight was different, that she was, in her own words, genuinely shaken and grateful and barely holding it together enough to say thank you. That's not a scripted soundbite. That's a person who didn't expect the moment to hit her the way it did. So how does a 21-year-old end up in that room in the first place? Let's rewind. Long before there was a palace, there was a public sports complex in Manila, the Rizal Memorial Sports Complex, and a little girl showing up after school with her older brother. Her earliest coach wasn't some imported specialist or an academy program. It was her own grandfather. She called him Papa Lolo. Every afternoon, the two of them would head to those same courts, and he'd run her through drills while she was still small enough that her socks kept slipping and her shoes lit up with every step she took. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Because years later, standing in front of a head of state, she'd bring up those exact shoes, the light-up ones, the ruffled socks, the chubby cheeks, as if to remind everyone in that polished room that the woman they were honoring used to be a kid who just wanted to play with her brother and her grandfather after school. Here's the thing about that memory, though. Papa Lolo never got to see any of this. Not the ranking, not the Wimbledon run, not the palace. And that absence sits underneath everything she's built since. Quiet, but constant. Isn't it strange how the people who shape us the most sometimes miss the exact moment we needed them to see? Because the moment did come, and it came fast. Let's talk about what actually happened on the grass at Wimbledon, because this is where the story stops being sentimental and starts being seismic. Eala walked into the tournament ranked outside the top 40. Not a nobody, but not someone anyone expected to make noise. Then she ran into the defending champion, the world number 3, on center court. And she didn't just compete, she won straight sets. The first set alone went to a tiebreak that stretched all the way to 9 points before she closed it out. Then she took the second set more comfortably, 6-2. Do you understand how rare that is? Beating a defending Wimbledon champion on the biggest stage in tennis as the outsider walking in? That win alone would have been the story. But she kept going. She reached the round of 16, a depth no Filipino man or woman had ever touched at a Grand Slam. Not once, not ever. She eventually lost to the Italian player ranked 17th in the world, and it wasn't a blowout. It went 3 sets, close ones, the kind of match where you can see a player pushing right up against her ceiling without quite breaking through it. But losing that match almost didn't matter anymore. The damage, the good kind of damage, was already done. She flew home with a new career-high ranking of 28, the highest any Filipino has ever reached in professional tennis. Full stop. So what happens after a moment like that? You'd think the country would erupt, and in a lot of ways it did, but the real reaction, the one that mattered, came from the very top. Within days, word came down that the president wanted to honor her personally. Social media exploded before she even landed. Fans dug up old clips of her junior matches. News outlets ran her Wimbledon highlights on loop. And then came the ceremony itself, where things got a little unusual, because the president, in front of cameras, essentially admitted there was no existing playbook for this kind of achievement, that he told her, half joking, that the country didn't actually have an established protocol for honoring an achievement like hers, that they were more or less improvising the whole event just to have an excuse to stand next to her and take a photo. Isn't it wild that a head of state would say that part out loud on the record instead of pretending the ceremony had always been inevitable? But this is where the story could have stayed small. Just a nice ceremony, a nice quote, a nice photo op. Except it didn't stay small, because barely 2 weeks after the palace, she was already scheduled to leave the country again, this time headed toward a tournament in Washington, D.C. That's the second escalation here. This isn't a girl who peaked and got celebrated for it. This is a girl whose celebration happened in the middle of an active, ongoing climb. The ranking that got her into that palace wasn't a ceiling. Multiple people close to her program have said it plainly. Nobody actually knows where her ceiling is yet. Her 2026 season alone included a breakthrough into the top 50 back in January, followed by her first WTA 125 title, then a second one a few months later where she beat her own doubles partner in the final. 30 wins, 18 losses. Close to $1.5 million in prize money for the year. Does that sound like a fluke to you? Or does that sound like a player who's just getting started?
Now here's where we need to pump the brakes a little, because it's easy to get swept up in the palace footage and the standing ovations and forget to ask the harder question: does any of this actually change anything? A citation is nice, a presidential compliment is nice, but citations don't resurface courts, they don't fund coaching programs, they don't guarantee that the next kid with a grandfather and a public tennis court gets the same shot Eala did. Tennis in the Philippines has historically sat outside the national sports identity entirely. It's never had the institutional backing that basketball or boxing enjoys. So when the president stood there and said, on camera, that the entire nation was behind her and that he'd personally help with anything she needed, is that a real commitment? Or is that the kind of thing leaders say in front of cameras and quietly forget about once the cameras are off? That's the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all the applause, and it's a fair one. But here's where the story answers itself, at least partially, because 6 months before that ceremony, this same young woman had walked onto those exact same childhood courts, the Rizal Memorial Complex, as the emotional centerpiece of a home tournament, and she lost in the quarterfinals, on the courts her grandfather had taught her on, in front of the country she was trying to make proud. She came up short, and by most accounts, it wrecked her for a while. She dedicated that entire tournament to Papa Lolo's memory, and it ended in defeat instead of celebration. That's not the kind of detail that makes it into a highlight reel, but it's the detail that makes everything after it mean something. Because 6 months later, standing in front of the president, she brought up those same courts by name, not as a footnote, as the foundation of everything that followed. So when she finally spoke, really spoke about what all of this meant, she didn't lean on statistics or rankings. She went back to the socks, the light-up shoes, the after-school drills with her brother and her grandfather on courts that, at the time, meant nothing to anyone outside her own family. That's the quote that traveled fastest online, faster than anything about Wimbledon or rankings or prize money. A young woman describing herself as a chubby-cheeked kid in ruffled socks, standing in a palace, being told by a head of state that an entire nation of over 100 million people was rooting for her. And that's really what this whole story is about when you strip away the ceremony and the framed paper and the cameras. It's not about a milestone. Milestones are too small a word for it. It's about a country having to redefine in real time what its athletes are allowed to look like, what sport they're allowed to dominate, what stage they're allowed to stand on, how high they're allowed to climb. Nobody built that ceiling for her because nobody knew it needed to exist. Now they do. And the number 28 isn't the finish line. Every person following this story seems to agree on one thing. That number is going to move again, and probably soon. So here's the question I'll leave you with. When she walks out onto the court in Washington in a couple of weeks, does she treat that palace ceremony as validation or as unfinished business? Tell me what you think happens next in the comments below. And if you want to be there when the next chapter drops, make sure you're subscribed because this story is nowhere near over.